start a little early. Thank you all for coming. This is the unintended risk of trusting Active Directory. So my name is Will Schrader. My handle is Harmjoy. Yeah, I've got my little Yoda picture. I think that was someone on our team is pretty good Photoshop. So I'm a red teamer, and I like to call myself an offensive engineer. I work at SpectreOps, so I build a lot of tools. I'm an Adaptive Threat Division alumni, I blog a lot, and I'm a co-founder and co-developer for GhostPact, the new C# stuff that we'll demo a little bit today, Empire, Bloodhound, and the Veil framework.
So my name is Lee Christensen, Tifkin on Twitter. I do a bunch of stuff at SpectreOps. I'm also just going after shiny things all the time, so be that offensive or defensive, I kind of flip both sides. I'm kind of in the background on a lot of things, so I don't see a lot of my projects, but I contribute in a lot of kind of behind-the-scenes type things.
Yep, and I'm going to have to kneel down. I'm Matt Nelson. Twitter is Enigma0x3. I'm a senior operator and researcher at SpectreOps, so I do a lot of the research that these guys kind of start building tools for, solving problems that we have on operations and stuff like that. I also blog a lot. I'm one of the few people in the world that claim they sort of like COM a little bit, and then hold a handful of CVEs.
All right, so we're going to start this talk with a question. What is admin access? We're going to make the argument that many of us have been kind of approaching this problem in operational testing kind of in the wrong way. We've been approaching the concept kind of in the wrong way. The admin access is a lot more complicated than just membership and local administrators. While this covers many of the cases, there are some edge cases where things can get really interesting, where you can perform certain actions on host without being a member of the local administrators group. So this is kind of one of our big points in the talk, is that admin access is more than membership and just local administrators. So, the true nature of admin access. Our controversial statement is membership in a system's local administrators group, like I mentioned, isn't what actually matters. What actually matters is what local and domain groups or principals, we're talking about a domain scenario with the domain-driven system. We care about what local domain groups or users have access to specific remote resources on a host, whether that's RPC servers, remote registry, WMI, SQL, many, there's a million of these different host-based security descriptors. And we'll get into exactly what security descriptors are and what they matter, or why they matter. So as an example, you have your host. Many people just think, okay, I need to pop this host. I'm going to do like a Bloodhound attack graph, or I'm going to do whatever else, and I can figure out who's the member of local admins on this box, and then I'm going to do my lateral movement and pop the machine. But this is what this system actually is. It's not just one host where like local admins is the monolithic, you get remote access to the system. A host is a collection of services. Many of these are registered in Active Directory through Kerberos or other authentication protocols. So you can have your WMI, your WinRM, Service Control Manager, all this kind of stuff I talked about. So what controls access to these particular remote services that all act independently? So again, there's not a single security descriptor, or there's not a single set of rules that says user A, B, and C has access to all these things. Each service contains their own set of rules in the host in the form of security descriptors. It's just binary blobs that says who can do what to this particular service. So for example, for a service control manager, you can have, local administrators have generic all, we'll get into all these kind of components in a second, but you can also have domain users that are explicitly added, whether intentionally or unintentionally, to the security descriptors for particular services that might allow you to perform certain type of traditionally administrative actions on the host.
So Will just stated that services have security descriptors, and those security descriptors control access to those services. So what are security descriptors, and why should we care about them? Security descriptors are the mechanism that Windows uses to control access to a service. So any sort of secureable object, we say. Secureable objects are, so what are they? Any object that can have a security descriptor. Kind of a dumb definition. But essentially what that means is you have this security descriptor. It's just a structure inside of Windows. It has a bunch of different components. As an attacker, we're very interested in those two red highlighted fields there. So an owner and a DACL. So what we're going to dive into a little bit about what these are. Worth mentioning is the SACL, because that is a component that defenders can use to monitor access to these objects. So we're going to focus in a little bit on the owner and the DACL and how we as attackers can use them to our advantage. So the first instance is that owner field. Owners have complete control over an object by default. So if I'm the owner of an object, then that means I can add rights to it. So I could say Will now has rights to control this object. I can write to that object. I just have complete control. Likewise, that second field was the DACL. So the DACL is a list of access control entries. So it's just a list of permissions granting or denying users access to the object. So if you take like a file object, for example, in the DACL, there's different rules that allow and deny users access to that file. These files are not the only secureable object, like we mentioned. There's a bunch of different kinds out there, file shares, files, Active Directory objects. All of these have owners. All of these have DACLs on them that control access to those objects. So how does this normally look? If you've ever right-clicked on a file, for example, and looked at the permissions, this is what it's looking like underneath. You can see the DACL is outlined there, and there's on the left, you see the type of access. So these are allow access. And then inside, there's a list of permissions that are granted. So you can see we're allowing marketer read access in this case, and you can see that IT admin and the administrators have full control over this folder up at the top. So that's it. In this case, we're talking about a file object, the downloads folder. And in addition, so that's the DACL, and then up right underneath, you can see the owner is that IT administrator as well. So that owner can do anything to that object. So we have these objects, they have their owners and their DACLs on them. And then when another user tries to interact with that service, so let's say it's a file share, the individual service performs an authorization check. It's not some centralized component inside of Windows that's doing the authorization check or deciding who gets access to the file share. It's the file share service itself that performs the authorization check. The same goes for WMI, the Service Control Manager, etc. Those all have security descriptors that say who can access each one of those services. So what the service does is it looks at the user who's connecting to the service, and then it looks at its security descriptor and says, is the connecting user a member in the DACL, in the security descriptor? If so, we're going to grant them access. If it's not in the list of accepted users, they're going to be denied access. So fairly simple. You see this a lot. So a lot of Windows services has the local administrators group added or granted access to things. So for example, the Service Control Manager or WMI or the SIFs, the file share, local administrators by default are added to the DACLs of each one of these services. That's why they can access them. However, those local administrators could also be removed from those same security descriptors, and then they wouldn't be able to access those services anymore.
Cool. So why do we really care about all of that? Would be a good question to have. So as far as Active Directory environments and specifically all the hosts inside them, it's really hard to determine if a DACL change is supposed to be there. If it was made by some sort of product on accident or a misconfiguration, or if it was maliciously put there. So doing that at scale is not an easy thing to do. Does anybody here monitor all the DACLs on their endpoints? Yeah, exactly. So, like I mentioned, I've got existing misconfigurations. So these are typically useful in a privilege escalation scenario. The ability for a low privileged user to modify something due to a DACL misconfiguration. Or malicious configuration. So an attacker, placing a, backdoor DACL on an object in order to kind of remain inside the environment. So the cool thing about these is, since it's not easy to audit or monitor outside of SACLs, the forensic footprint that exists there is pretty small. So it's a pretty safe way for an attacker to remain persistent in an environment and not really have to worry about that backdoor access being discovered. Additionally, many teams, blue and red, aren't aware of these configurations, let alone using them or looking for them, which kind of adds this stealth component for utilizing these operationally. So like Will and Lee mentioned, host-based security descriptors is more than just a service control manager. So like Lee said, all of the different services and resources in Windows are controlled via entries for the DACL. So
did anyone happen to see our talk last year at Derby on the host-based stuff? A few hands, yeah. So we covered additional, like 5 different backdoor scenarios specifically for host-based DACLs. Additionally, we've done some research on the Active Directory side that we'll talk about in a bit. So we're only going to touch on a couple of use cases specifically on the host side, but there's many, 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 many more.
Yeah, this is just the surface. So Microsoft's documented a lot of these securable objects out there. In the documentation, there are roughly 20 to 30 of them. Through enumeration, we've identified over 70 that exist. So there's a lot of attack surface as far as different operational components you can utilize. For RPC servers specifically, which is, like we mentioned, a securable object, if you're going to utilize those, unless you really want to spend the time reverse engineering, Microsoft's documented most of those RPC servers for you, which is really, really nice. So Lee also has a script called find at registry security descriptors sitting somewhere on the internet. I don't think it's on a GitHub. I found it on some cached website earlier today. So we'll have that reposted as well, which can kind of show you what it might look like when you go to enumerate those. Has anybody heard of NT Object Manager from James Forshaw? So it's a really great tool to also kind of go through and analyze some of the underlying components of Windows, specifically some of the security descriptor stuff. So when you're using Lee scripts, this is what the output looks like. So all this does is it goes through the registry and it tries to identify any kind of binary blobs, and then it tries to convert that into a valid security descriptor, and then output that for you. So this will just kind of show you some of the different objects that are registered in the registry that have a security descriptor applied to them. And then you can manually go through the hundreds of thousands of results and kind of derive what you want to utilize there. So when we're talking about security descriptors, there are kind of 2 different kinds per se. So there's persistent and there's kind of runtime or dynamic objects. Each object can get their security descriptor from a different place. So just because the RPC, some RPC service has a security descriptor applied to it, how it's applied might not be the same for some other object. So you've got persistent objects, so a security descriptor that's applied to something like a file. You right-click properties via the security tab, that's the security descriptor for that file. The registry, etc. Runtime would kind of apply towards more dynamic objects, so things like processes and tokens. So security descriptors, like they mentioned, define access to what resource a user can have, which more or less defines boundaries, for a user as far as what they can do. So when you're enumerating these, we typically have an approach of enumerating locally and remotely, both privileged and unprivileged. The reason for this is because in order to enumerate some components, you have to have specific token levels and just kind of get as much information as you can, doing it locally, remotely, and privileged and unprivileged will get you the best results. So an example of this remote registry, like we will mentioned, we talked last year at Derby on something similar to this. So just think of a scenario of remotely dumping a machine's account hash. So for those of you that aren't familiar with that, thanks to Benjamin's great work and many others, you can use that machine account hash to do things like silver tickets and other various attacks. So this kind of attack, or this kind of backdoor persistent access, is going to set up to allow an attacker to remotely retrieve a remote computer's machine account hash without having any administrative access to that host. Administrative, yeah. Due to a very granular DACL change that we've made. So the process for backdooring this would look something like this. So first, in order to apply the backdoor, we want to allow a specific user or group. It doesn't have to be one thing or another. It can be whatever user account or group access you want to add to it. Allowing that user to remotely access remote registry. So that's defined via the WinReg key in the registry, so you can use WMI to go over and add that specific user that you want to be able to access that. Then you just add a few different pieces to some different registry hives and keys that will allow you to pull back the key material that you need to calculate and retrieve the machine account hash for that guy.
So in that case, we're modifying the security descriptor of the registry, the remote registry service, to allow an unprivileged user to get access to these sensitive registry keys and values.
So So obviously you need administrative access or privilege in the environment to do this, given it's a persistent technique. But that can allow an attacker to say, I want, for the exchange server, for the domain controller, I want to grant Nancy from HR the ability to retrieve this account hash, or I want to grant authenticated users or domain users, so that if they get back in the environment, they can immediately elevate back up in that domain. So once we've added that backdoor, the process for retrieving this is pretty straightforward. So as that backdoor user or group, we're going to connect to the remote host over remote registry. We're able to do that because we've added that backdoor privilege for that specific user. Open up specific registry keys that are linked to LSA and extract those classes. Combine these classes, the values to calculate the boot key. Use that boot key to decrypt the LSA key. Then we can finally use the LSA key to decrypt the machine account hash for that remote host. So again, we're all able to do this because even though the user is not an administrator on the remote host, we've granted a specific user or group the appropriate permissions for the DAPL that allow us to access this information. Does anybody think that they would be able to see that kind of thing on their network right now? Maybe two. Once that happens, everybody gets a silver ticket. So, yeah.
All right, so that was the host side. And now we're going to talk about the Active Directory security descriptor side. Then we're going to combine them together and show how the system works kind of holistically. So again, all these security descriptors are just the access control model. Active Directory needs an access control model just like everything else. So one really big advantage with Active Directory is that by default, the DAPLs for almost every single object in Active Directory, users, groups, subnets, like OUs, almost everything, can be enumerated by any domain authenticated user through LDAP. So you do not have to be privileged in the domain to pull all of the security descriptor information for almost every object in Active Directory. This is actually something that's been integrated into the Bloodhound project to where you can actually start to map these permissions at scale. Some other advantages of a backdoor approach or misconfiguration approach for Active Directory with ACLs is these changes also have a minimal forensic footprint. So even if people do find a bad thing and know it's bad, it's very difficult to, unless they had specific event log tuning on the domain controller where that change was made, when that change was made, it's very difficult to figure out who even made the change or exactly when the change was made. Changes in Active Directory for persistence also will survive operating system and domain functional level upgrades. This kind of leads into a term that we're kind of calling misconfiguration debt, to where if you have a domain that's been around for 15 years and you installed some crappy third-party thing 13 years ago that added itself all these permissions and all this kind of stuff in the access control model, even if you remove that solution as your domain is upgraded, many of these permissions likely still persist. So you just get all this cruft and things start to build on each other. And we found old permissions from like 2003 or something like that still exist in a modern domain. Also, anti-audit measures can be taken. We're not going to touch on this really during this presentation, but a little over a year ago, Andy Robbins and myself gave a talk called an Ace Up the Sleeve at Black Hat, building an Active Directory persistent backdoor. So there's ways that you can actually prevent like domain admins from enumerating the security descriptor information for specific objects or hiding principals. So even if people find the bad entry, know it's bad, know it's not a accidental misconfiguration, you can actually like take anti-audit measures to mess with blue teamers even more. That was us trying to go as evil as possible. So this is the graphical representation of all that security descriptor stuff for Active Directory in ADUC. So we have permission entry for victim user, so this is the victim object. We have the principal, so this is the person that has the rights. And we see there's a whole bunch of different rights. Some of the ones we care about are like modify permissions, so you can grant yourself anything you want, modify the owner because they have full control, force reset the password, lots of other stuff. So what rights do you care about? In the white paper that's on our site, along with that was in correlation with the Ace Up the Sleeve talk, we have like a 60-page Active Directory only security descriptor white paper that covers all these in more depth. But in general, we care about the generic all right, which grants generic rights to the object, the generic right object, which allows for modifications of almost all properties of a specified object, right DACL, which you don't have the ability to like force reset someone's password, but you have the ability to grant yourself the ability to force reset someone's password. Or right owner, so if all you have is right owner, you can just modify the owner of that object to yourself, and then you have full control. Object-specific rights we care about. This is not complete, somewhat abbreviated. There's a couple new ones we have in the new Bloodhound stuff. But for users, we generally care about the force reset password right. So can we reset the password without knowing the previous value? Or can we modify the service principal name so we can do targeted curb roasting, say an SPN, curb roasting, resetting it? For groups, can we modify the member property to modify group membership? For computers, we actually don't have a generic ACL-based or DACL-based takeover primitive yet outside of lapse. So you have the ability to grant somebody the ability to read the lapse password as a backdoor, but outside of that, we don't have a generic takeover. For GPOs, we care, can someone modify the GPC file syspath? So do they have the ability to edit the GPO files on sysvol? And for domains, the domain object itself, which is a securable object, if you have the right DACL or generic all ability over the root domain object, you can grant yourself a DC sync rights. So as an example, abusing Exchange. Exchange Server is one of the worst perpetrators of really messed up ACL-based configurations, or at least it was. Newer versions of Exchange have cleaned this up, but previous versions of Exchange would just grant itself 10 million rights all over the domain. And again, because even if the domain is upgraded or Exchange is upgraded, things don't go back in and rip out the old ACL rights because people don't want to break stuff. So if you had ever installed an old version of Exchange in your environment, those bad misconfigurations are probably still there. It's a ton of stuff. So this makes it a perfect spot for us to blend within the noise. So specifically, pre-Exchange Server 2007 SP1, Exchange granted the right DACL privilege against the domain object itself for the Exchange Trusted Subsystem group. So this is a group that all Exchange servers are a member of, and that group has the ability to modify the ACL information on the root domain object. So, just as a pen test tip, I guess, if you ever compromise an Exchange server, you elevate the system, because system is going to use the machine account hash permissions or the machine account permissions when it's communicating on the network, you should be able to grant anyone you want the ability to DC sync on the domain. So you're just one hop away. Just an example, and we have a case study that will go into that.
So we've talked a little bit about, on the host side, that we have these different services we can interact with now. We've also talked about how we have Active Directory. We have Active Directory objects that we can also interact with. Why this is interesting is because when you start combining those two separate kind of disparate systems together, you start introducing a bunch of different risks inside of the environment. So let's say you have an individual host not joined to the domain. That's a pretty secure host because it's in control of what can access that machine. So it can define, who controls access to the service control manager remotely. It can say who accesses like WMI, that kind of thing. That host itself is solely in control of itself. After a machine is joined to Active Directory, however, this control model changes. So the machine itself is no longer in charge of authentication. So an individual host by default is going to be using like the SAM database for authentication and using like NTLM underneath for authentication. After you join Active Directory, that changes. Kerberos and the domain controller get thrown into the situation, and that machine isn't the sole authentication provider. That permits a variety of different attacks like silver tickets and golden tickets, which can allow an attacker access to the system. Likewise, key material is no longer stored solely on that individual host. So, for example, if the host is just isolated by itself, all the passwords are in the SAM database, and if an attacker attacks another machine on the network, they're not going to be able to immediately access this individual host because all the passwords are stored on that host only. After you join Active Directory, that changes. The domain controller has passwords in it, certificate authority, CA servers have some info, your federation services may have some stuff. All these things may end up compromising those machines may grant you access to this individual host now, since it's joined to the domain. Likewise, that individual host is no longer in control of its own security groups anymore. So by default, when you join a machine into Active Directory, the domain administrators group is added to the local administrators group. So now you have these other groups in the domain that can now access this machine. Those groups may have other groups and other users in it, and so now all of those people are implicitly trusted to access this machine. Likewise, management of that machine is no longer to that individual host anymore. Before, if it was just one host by itself, you log in, use the GUI, use whatever you want, configure the host. Once it's joined to Active Directory, however, you bring in other management solutions, such as group policy. So now there's other things in the network and in the domain that are going to be influencing how this host functions and is configured, and it may result in unintended access to this host. So how does this look? Again, just a different way to looking at that. So when you're in a work group, so just that isolated computer by itself, you have local users and groups only. Those are the only security principles. You have, how do you control access to that machine? And that's based off of host-based security descriptors. So we can change like the WMI service, the service control manager individually, and grant other local users and groups to those services. Authentication is through the SAM database, so like NTLM or LM. And then how is that resource administered or configured? Usually that's like a manual process, or you may have like some like PowerShell scripts on the machine that configure the object or the host. However, once you join that machine to Active Directory, this entire model is expanded, which could result in some unintended consequences. So now you have, in terms of security principles, you now have domain users and groups being added who have control to this machine now. In terms of access, granting access to this machine, those same domain groups may be controlled by other people in the environment. So you may add a group to the local administrators group, and then a random IT administrator in a different part of the network may start adding users to that group that you never intended. Those users that were added were never intended to gain access to your individual host. In addition, you have different authentication mechanisms that can now be used to access the host beyond just like the SAM database. Kerberos, NTLM, those include different keys that you can access to gain access to this individual host. And configuration is now changed because you have things like GPOs that can be abused to configure the host.
All right, same thing graphically, hammering the point home. So we have our single host, and again, there's a million different services on it. We're going to focus just on DCOM, distributed COM. We have a local user with admin, there's a local administrators group, and a distributed COM users group. That is just by default. So say this admin is a member of local admins, and we have an empty distributed COM users group. Those have the ability to invoke distributed COM objects on the system. Okay, relatively secure, randomized admin password, blah, blah, blah. So then we have our domain. We have different users, groups, machines, people logged in, and this is essentially, that Bloodhound style attack graph. So you can have domain users nested in additional groups, say domain admins. And say this machine is joined to AD. And by default, domain admins are going to be added to the local admins group. So now we have Lee, domain admins, everyone else that can invoke distributed COM objects. And you can also have individual domain users, other principals, that can be manually added, whether through some third-party software or maliciously or whatever, to things like the distributed COM users group. So now this person has the ability to invoke distributed COM objects and get code execution in the remote system, even though they are not in local admins. You also have all the inbound control attack paths to all these users and groups as well. So this is all the additional risk that you're introducing to this individual host by the single act of adding into Active Directory. You can also have users that log in on this host, so domain principals that log in on this host. They could be members of additional other groups and everything. So the idea here is, on the first part, you have additional risk inbound into the host. And depending on the security of your host, say you don't lock it down, you have some RCE, sorry, I'm not playing that. And you have additional outbound different kind of control objects or relationships going from the host. So someone compromised the system and has Eternal Blue or whatever on it. I'm just going to keep talking while they have to chug really warm smear enough ice. I'm very happy. So that machine is compromised, the token stolen, and that person that's a member of these server admins, there's now outbound access to other nodes in the network that your machine affected. So inbound and outbound. You want me to keep talking while you're drinking? Okay. All right. Looks like me the last 2 years. So security implications. Host-based security descriptors are kind of the missing link when thinking about domain attack graphs. So we've been thinking about these domain attack graphs for a while, like the ANSI stuff, Bloodhound, John Lambert stuff and all that. So host-based security descriptors kind of help logically fill this gap in the entire system.
Something I do want to emphasize there's a ton of securable objects that nobody has looked at. There's the obvious things that we've mentioned already, like WMI, the Service Control Manager, all those things. But there's hundreds of RPC servers that are accessible remotely that I'm sure none of you have ever heard of and have never looked at. So that's why we're trying to emphasize is there's all this additional attack surface that nobody's looking at that is extremely important, and we'll show why in a little bit. Likewise, we know that there's existing misconfigurations. We've blatantly shown that with Active Directory through Bloodhound, and we'll give an example of this later on. Likewise, a really important thing too is when you combine these two worlds together, you have misconfigurations on a host. Those misconfigurations can, lead to escalation or lateral movement inside of Active Directory and the environment as a whole. So essentially, like host-based security descriptors can fill in or can provide opportunities for escalation inside of Active Directory when there's not solely a single escalation path in Active Directory just itself. The inverse is true as well. So if you're trying to attack an individual host, you may not be able to gain access to it. But if you go through Active Directory, you can then gain access to that host. So it brings in additional attack paths and attack vectors to get access to whatever you're targeting.
So when you join a system in Active Directory, like we kind of hammered in, you're introducing additional nodes into the access graph that may affect the security of other systems. Again, perfect world, perfect stock install and everything, there's no problem. But in the real world, there are going to be an enormous number of misconfigurations or misconfiguration debt and all these types of things, or potentially malicious backdoors. And again, you're also implicitly trusting the security of a large number of other systems in the graph as well. So you're almost certainly, as Lee mentioned, exposing your system services to more access than you realize. So we realize this kind of maybe seems self-evident, but this is just the way we broke the problem down of thinking of host-based security descriptors combined with Active Directory and everything to where the actual attack graph is enormous, to where we only model the 80 Active Directory, like ACL-based component with Bloodhound. In the real world, or in the what the attack graph actually is, would include the security descriptor information for every single service and every single host, including all those hundreds or thousands of RPC servers.
Something that, on that same note, is so say you have your individual host, say it's like a database that has tons of information. You want to restrict access to it and limit that as much as possible. So maybe you just allow one domain group access to that. But that domain group itself is controlled by IT administrators that may not have the same security mindset that you do. So they may inadvertently, without understanding the security implications, start adding users and other groups to that group. And so, again, it's unintended consequences. You never had that intent of granting anybody else access, but because other people didn't have the same security mindset as you, these new paths have been introduced.
Cool. So first case study that we're going to talk about for kind of weaponization, we're going to pick on Exchange again. So like Walt mentioned, the Exchange trusted subsystem, which contains all the administrator or all the Exchange servers in that group, typically will have a large amount of rights over the domain or the domain objects. So we can kind of abuse the remote registry backdoor to go from keeping our access in the environment by allowing any defined group or user to basically become instant DA. So, video demo of this. I don't know how computers work. So add remote reg backdoor is a function we wrote to backdoor a remote registry specifically for removing or extracting a machine account hash. So let's give it a computer name. In this case, we're doing Exchange. We're adding a domain user called Jason. So Jason has no privilege in the environment. He's just some random Joe Schmo. After we have added or modified the security descriptor on those objects.
That's the entire vector.
Yeah. We can now switch over to JSON here in a second. What's cool about this is a scenario, like I mentioned earlier, would be if an attacker gets kicked out, they can refish, they can add a group to that, and then kind of pivot up that way. So we've got a function called get remote machine account hash, give it the computer name as that user, and then it'll just pop out the machine account hash for remote host. So since we're doing this against Exchange, we can utilize kind of the misconfiguration data a lot of organizations kind of inherit to do some really nasty stuff. So here we're just taking that hash and we're using overpass the hash to kind of put ourselves in that context since we've got the machine accounts hash. So we use Mimikatz to do this. The user is going to be the Exchange server dollar, so the computer account and the hash of that. So now that we're running as that, we can pop open Mimikatz again, and we can kind of demonstrate that we can do more or less whatever we want. In this case, since the Exchange Trusted Subsystem has a lot of control over those different objects, we can do something like DC sync. We can instantly pull
grant ourselves DC sync rights or whatever rights that Exchange server.
So here we've just pulled the Caribou TGT hash from the domain using the backdoor that we've installed as a just having access to that Exchange server.
Cool. All right. So kind of cool. There's one, you make one little backdoor to one system. There's no malware running. You can come back in and then pop the entire domain at will forever, basically, unless someone found that backdoor in the registry on that one Exchange box and they wiped everything out. So second case study. That one was persistence. So again, you had to be elevated on that Exchange server to implement the backdoor, but persistence. Now we're going to cover existing misconfigurations, and Lee's going to cover a really cool thing that he found. So we have a couple of ingredients. First ingredient is unconstrained delegation. So everybody perfectly understands Kerberos, so I'm just going to be able to explain this in 20 seconds. Yeah, totally. So there's going to be a link at the end if you want more information on this. But TLDR, if a server is configured for unconstrained delegation, service ticket request to that server will include the requester's ticket granting ticket stuffed in the service ticket. So user authenticates to a service on an unconstrained server. That user's TGT is stuffed in the service ticket, sent to the server, and that's cached at least for a small period of time, if not more, in LSAS on that unconstrained server. So TLDR, if you can get a principal to authenticate to an unconstrained server that you control, you can extract their ticket granting tickets out of memory, whether through LSAS manipulation with Mimikatz or through using some of the approved real LSA APIs. For more information on unconstrained delegation, as always, the link is always adsecurity.org with Sean Metcalf. He talks a bunch more about a bunch more of the operational details. Second ingredient, we want to be able to extract those TGTs. So we started building this tool set a bit ago to actually support this attack primitive that we came up with. But Rubius is a new C# Kerberos abuse toolkit that's essentially a recoded version of some of Kikio's implementation. And Kikio is the other project from Benjamin, the other main project besides Mimikatz. It also includes the ability for ticket extraction. So there's a monitor action, which you run it on a host, elevated on a host, on an unconstrained server that you control. It'll monitor for 4624 logon events in the event log, and then it'll extract any new usable ticket granting ticket, Kirby's, so full cred objects out of memory from LSAS, using the approved LSA APIs. So we're not actually opening up a read handle to LSAS. So this isn't like running Mimikatz Circles tickets, Circles logon passwords. This is just using Windows APIs in an intended way, because they built the APIs, to extract these ticket blobs. This is the goal.
So I think I mentioned that there's hundreds and hundreds of RPC servers on machines that I'm pretty sure nobody's looked at before. This is one of those. So last year, when we were diving into host-based security descriptors, one of the RPC servers identified was printers. Printers are always fun. So I started diving into what goes into the print server RPC calls. So there's one interface that you can interact with called the Print System Remote Protocol, MSRP RPRN. Anybody ever looked at that? Nope. So this protocol has an interesting function in it. So as I was doing one day, I was reading through the technical specifications on Microsoft's website, thrilling reads, and as I was reading through, I came across one of these methods, RPC Remote Find First Printer Change Notification. Obviously looks malicious. Essentially, the purpose of it is to, I can say as a user, I can say, hey print server, notify me whenever you have a new print job. I'm just curious, so let me know whenever there's a new print job for whatever reason. What's the implication of this for me as an attacker? Well, how this works underneath is that any domain user can make that request of the print server. And Spooler is enabled on every single machine in modern domains. And so any user can actually request this from any print server in a domain. And so what happens is when I make that request, the print server itself, so the Spooler service, which is running a system, is actually going to immediately talk back to me just to test connectivity, and it's going to authenticate to whatever machine I tell it to. So I can say, for example, I could tell the Exchange server over there, hey, I want to monitor your print jobs, and when I say that, it's going to connect back to my machine as the Exchange server dollar account and try and authenticate to me. So why is that interesting? Well, this is a won't fix. I told Microsoft it's by design. I don't think that's a good idea, but my musings were not listened to. So again, what does this look like? So let's say I as the attacker, I'm on that top machine over there. I'm going to talk to this server over there and using this print protocol. I'm going to say, please authenticate to other host down there. When I make that request, the server is then server dollar, that's the server's domain account, is going to authenticate to SMB to other hosts. I get to choose, so I can coerce that machine to use Kerberos or NTLM authentication when I make that request. So why is that interesting? Bunch of different abuse scenarios, but we're just going to talk about that first one there, talking about unconstrained delegation. So if we compromise an unconstrained delegation server, I can use this to coerce the domain controller to authenticate back to me. When the domain controller authenticates to me, it's going to send its TGT, and I can use that TGT to DC sync because, So this is the recipe. I compromise a server that has unconstrained delegation. I start monitoring for TGTs using Rubius. And so it's going to check every 5 seconds for new people logging onto the machine. And then I'm going to use this printer bug to coerce a domain controller to authenticate to the server that I've compromised using spool sample, which is a tool I wrote. So. And then once you've got the domain controller's ticket, you load that up, DC sync profit. So what does this look like? So here we have Cobalt Strike. We're going to identify unconstrained delegation servers using PowerView. So we can see that this SharePoint server has unconstrained delegation enabled. That's fairly typical in some environments. So now we're going to pivot over to that SharePoint server. I don't know how, maybe we found some more privileged user, an IT admin's cred, whatever. We're going to pivot to that machine. Now we're on an unconstrained delegation server. We're going to start monitoring for new ticket granting tickets using Rubius. So now we're going to be monitoring specifically for the domain controller logging into this machine. And when it logs in, we're going to dump its ticket. So we're going to execute that. It's now monitoring for new logins. We're going to use spool sample to request that ticket. So this is going to coerce the domain controller to authenticate to the SharePoint server that I've compromised. I execute it. We wait a little while for this to happen, and you can see the domain controller authenticated and sent its TGT. Now we can extract the base64 encoded version of that. We're going to write that to a file using some PowerShell, that ticket.kirby. This is on my attacker's host. I'm going to write it there, go ahead and execute it. Now we're going to load it up. We're going to make a sacrificial logon session so we don't screw anything up. So, yeah, the password doesn't matter here. I'm just doing this so I don't clobber the current logon session. Then I'm going to load up the Kerberos ticket using Beacon. So Kerberos ticket use, path to the ticket I just loaded. Now that's going to be loaded up. And because I'm a domain controller now, I can use DC Sync to request any user's password. Sure done. Worked. So that's the point here is there is a bunch of different host-based security descriptors that can be used, potentially maliciously, or they're just enabled by default. Any authenticated user can do this. A lot of people, like for example, the session enumeration, so for a long time, SAMR and session enumeration was enabled by default on Windows, which I think is a great thing, or which wasn't a good idea. Microsoft has since made some changes to restrict that. So, for example, modern versions of Windows, you can't enumerate the local administrators group. Like we said, though, there's hundreds of RPC servers, and many of those have yet to been fully analyzed, and many of them allow any user to connect to them and interact with them. And that's exactly what we did with the print server one there, and there's many others.
So, summary. Access is it's more complicated, we'll say, than just the membership and local administrators. And host-based security descriptors, whether accidentally misconfigured, configured by defaults incorrectly, or maliciously backdoored, can have far-reaching implications for the security of other systems in the domain, and vice versa. You might have your database compromised because one host has a misconfigured host-based security descriptor. It's an extremely complex system. Defenses should focus on restricting access to all secureable objects, host, Active Directory, Exchange, SQL, and everything. This is kind of somewhat uncharted territory. We know people need to start building the tooling for this, spread awareness, and things like that. It's a very complicated problem, a very complex system, but we think we can start tackling some defensive components for it. So that's pretty much it. Unless we have any questions, we know we started a little bit early.
I do want to give a little shout out to Elad Shamir. I interacted with him previously, and he also subsequently found that printer bug thing. So just want to give a shout out to him as well.
Any questions?
Any questions?